Welcome to First Thursday in November. Ah, the chill in the dark of November brings on the season when we remember the passage of people who have gone before us. The first was the Feast of All Saints, and today the second, All Souls, which is now being referred to as a day of remembrance, which appears to be due to the reluctance to speak of the dead, lest perchance we are of Mexican descent where it is done with a certain mirth. This beginning is quickly followed up by Veterans Day, the 11th of November, which initially was called Armistice Day. It marked the end of the Great War on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The symbolic nature of these numbers was intended to convey the hope that this would be the war to end all wars, that we had realized that it had reached almost the final thing and stopped. And now it was important to stop indeed. I find myself in this season thinking about the service of two of my uncles who were very much part of my growing up. They are both saw intense action in the Second World War in opposite theaters and in different services, one on land and the other in the air. It is historically ironic that when they took off for their service, they were leaving behind parents who were Italian immigrants who had scarcely shed their Italian past, so little, in fact, that the language in their home was still Italian. The younger brother service took him to the invasion of Sicily. This irony led me to write a poem that is included in On Giving My Word. It comes at chapter that is named Fragments of a National Narrative, where it serves as an example of what I call a transition narrative. Transition narratives are a very basic part of our literary heritage, and they start with Cervantes' Don Quixote and go all the way to maybe a Jonathan Franzen's crossover. And they have to do with storylines, narratives that walked us through change, made it possible to go through change and not lose track of who one is. In the poem that I have in the book here, you'll run into a foreign name, Lampandusa. Lampandusa is the name of a tiny barren island off the coast of Sicily, near the coast of Africa. For that reason, it might have turned up in your news feed since it has become the primary pathway for African migrants headed to Europe. It figures in the poem because the last prince of Lampandusa wrote a novel, The Leopard. The Leopard is considered one of Italy's greatest novels. It is indeed a classic transition novel dealing with the transition caused by the cultural upheaval of the unification of Italy in the 19th century. The hero of this novel is named Tancreti, not, of course, a relative, but united to us by the long habit in Italy of naming people after the famous crusader. The poem. Ultramaris Tancredi overseas. Somewhere beyond the sea, along the northern shore of that isle at the end of the Italian boot, on a cape named for that famed paladin Orlando, dubbed Furioso, who upon recovering his sanity tracked Armamante, the vilest of medieval villains, to the Isle of Lampandusa, where he left him slain. in the very place where the last prince of Lampandusa had taken refuge, with his aged and ailing mother, driven to do so by the Allied bombardment that had struck the port of Palermo in April of 1943. In that attack, a wayward bomb struck the palazzo on the Via della Lampandusa, their ancestral but dilapidated home. So on the Cape of Orlando, they waited out the storm, which would once again change everything, as the Risorgimento had the century before. The prince knew that their way of life was about to give way to a new order about which they would have little or anything to say. So he sought some sanity in the memories of bygone days, working out a story in his head about the way a past transition had been navigated or could have been navigated by the late last Duke, Don Fabrizio, with the slyness of a fox, which fitted his name, had extinguished him from his peers on the right who refused to give way to change and were consequently dashed on the rocks, and from his peers on the left who chose to sell out to change and were washed into the sea of oblivion. Fabrizio's scheme centered on a youthful successor who would swim in the Risorgimento by doing a little of both. A handsome, charming, and cunning Tancreti, who the last prince was attempting to flesh out in his legacy novel, The Leopard. In July of that year, the Allied landing came, despite an ill wind and tide, on the low-lying beaches of the southernmost shore between the villages of Gila and Licata. The American Seventh Army brought with it a Tancredi, a real one, as useful, charming, and handsome as the imaginary one, wearing a corporal's stripe as part of his three-man team, which carried and fired an 81 millimeter mortar, whose purpose it was to clear the way for the advance of the tanks of the Second Armored. This Tancredi was fresh from a small Vermont farm, the youngest boy in a family of 10, whose parents had come from Italy in 1901. Italy was still the language of their home in which he was raised. His preparation for war was, one might say, high school football, part-time jobs fixing cars and filling stations and stocking shelves in the local general store, the hard physical work of dairying from dawn to dusk, and of course, running the woods with his brother on a hunt. The mission of the 7th was to drive across the low-lying center, 90 miles of hill terrain, cut by streams and woven together by ancient roads, which spun like an overlapping spiderweb. In order to deny the port of Palermo to the enemy, who were entrenched on the straits that separated the island from the mainland, behind which they called the Etna line. Once the 7th had secured Palermo, they pivoted and raced down the coast to the Straits of Messina own the island itself, which meant that they would pass through the Capo di Orlando, where Lampandusa cowered dreaming of his Tancredi, scarcely aware of the foreign presence. In fact, the 7th did on the 7th day of August, with the real Tancredi on point, focused on the job to be done, scarcely registering the marks of an alien land, except perhaps for a fleeting smile when a mate named the place that they were passing, the Cape of Orlando, to which he softly rejoined, "That's my oldest brother's name." In the Straits of Messina, Tancreti would recall Patton driving past, saluting them, the lowly GIs, a moment they all relished. To think that one as high as that hard-charging, pistol-wearing general had saluted them just before they were all packed up and redeployed to England. On D+1, this Tancredi and his buddies stepped onto the Omaha beach, hunkered down till the breakthrough came at San Lo, and then they were again on the run, lying down mortar fire down the border of Belgium out onto the outskirts of Aachen. On the heels of the fierce and desperate defenders, it was there that he was wounded and sent down to the hospital unit, only to return to his unit at his insistence and back to the run. Until wounded again, he was sent home, overwhelmed by the exhaustion that caught up with him once he had stood out down. Back in the States, he found the world was changed, ever much as that of the princes whose path he had crossed, without either one being aware of the other. The supply chain built during the war meant that dairying in Vermont was on the way out, as was the textile industry, which would be bought by Goldfrapp and sent south, as were the machine shops who now competed with an industry dispersed across the nation. As was its rustic Puritan ethic and its Calvin Coolidge faith in business. Yet the resourcefulness that had distinguished him as a soldier made him a formidable survivor in the Vermont of outsiders. Tourists, persons of means seeking picturesque respite, creative individuals seeking fulfillment in the purity of craft. Many of his peers were at war with this change. He was not. Many of his peers sold out to that change. He did not. But in his quiet, persistent way, he navigated a path that zigged and zagged like a mortar unit on the front, never letting go of the deep things in the land of his birth. Paired with a Vermont girl with deep Vermont roots that he met at a Woodstock dance, he fostered and coached a family of kids and received from them a bounty of grandchildren, all who live and work in the heart of a new Vermont. Like Lampandusa's imagined Tancreti, he was able to bend and yet snap back. The former lives on in a story, which Italy recognizes as one of its greatest narratives. The latter lives on in the reality of Vermont and is the source of my story of an American soldier. Billy's older brother, by a few years, Alfred, had traveled west just before the war had begun, a couple of years before. My father had helped to get him into college, and he was living with us then on and off. When the war arrived in 1942 at the end, he was quick to enlist and was attracted by the Air Force's training program at the University of Nebraska. He served as a gunnery officer on a B-29. In the early phase of their deployment, he flew over the Camel's Hump into China to bomb the Japanese forces there. Later, he was transferred to Tinian, where he flew on bombing raids across the Japanese homeland. The last of which ditched on its return in the China Sea. Amazingly, he was rescued by a seaplane, only to have the seaplane crash on taking off. And then, even more amazingly, to be rescued by a sub that got him out and safe home. It strikes me that neither brother, in spite of their many decorations, thought of themselves as warriors. They thought about their service as a job that someone had to do. And it strikes me that for the most part, that was true of the American GI. They had a story about themselves which made them pragmatic, innovative fighters who bested a military that appeared to be more highly proficient and regimented, which they could not best on the parade grounds, but did on the battlefield. When they came home, that same attitude allowed them to go back to work and raise the families that they did. The picture of Alfred on the front steps of my home in Carroll, Iowa, includes me. I must have been about 2 at that time, and I often think of the picture as Michael Goes to War. In a sense, I did, as did most of my generation. This put the idea in our head that we should serve, as many of us did. As we watch another generation deal with war that did not end as the hope had it, we worry that the narrative is lost and confounded. Perhaps this story might be of some help. First Thursday in December will bring us back to where this whole series began a year ago. We'll be well into Advent, and we'll revisit the narrative of Mary's journey to Bethlehem, a little wiser and hopefully a little bit more proficient with our production. Thank you.